So let's talk about mustering a devout force of warrior nuns to purge the enemy with Melter and Flamer on the battlefields of the 41st millennium. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I'll be sharing a few thoughts and ideas on collecting a Sisters of Battle army if you're starting from a standing start. In the video we'll talk about a few reasons why you might want to, planning a collection before you really get going, the first steps and the things that you might start picking up for them, and then a bit of discussion around expanding to some more specialised options. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump straight in. So why would you want to collect Sisters in Warhammer 40k 9th then? The army has been a fan favourite, and despite basically being near unsupported for well over a decade with the same metal models, you still bump into people who collected and played them, and they were certainly a popular release when Games Workshop redid their range with all new plastic kits. The Sisters are sort of a counterpart to the Space Marines, where the Space Marines are sort of knightly monks in space. The Sisters are basically your nuns with guns, and the militant arm of the ecclesiarchy, the defenders of the imperial faith. The creation of the Sisters of Battle was vitally important during the Age of Apostasy, when they denounced Goj Van Dyer for the heretic that he was, and brought a new era of unification to the Imperium, bringing the Civil War to a close. In the 41st millennium today, their convents are scattered across the galaxy, and their fighting forces are very elite. They're all-female formations, with power armors, bolters, and a particular liking for purging heretics and witches with flamer and melter gun. Their current plastic range at the moment is very recent, and one of the most modern and up-to-date ranges in Warhammer 40k. Largely the re-released updated kits went down very well indeed, and they combine a pretty unique look of futuristic tech, combined with all sorts of baroque and religious iconography. Anything from burning braziers and stained glass windows on their tanks, mini reliquaries wherever you can look, and some very disturbing sinister little cherub constructs, bearing incense and ammunition onto the battlefield to support the forces. It looks like Games Workshop has done a complete about-face on them. They look like they're going to be well supported going forward. I'd say they're now one of their flagship armies, with really quite a decent range of models to choose from. In-game, the Sisters are currently very strong at the moment, though obviously that will wax and wane as new codexes are released and additions change, but I think in general they will typically be a fun army to play with. Generally their units are fairly close range and quite hard hitting, but maybe not always the toughest to take out in return. They may wear power armour, but they are only toughness 3. It means there's usually quite a good trade out of them dealing damage and then taking it in return, and they can be a little bit less frustrating to play against sometimes than some of the other armies, even if they do remain very powerful. I really like their in-game miracle dice mechanic. You roll dice when you complete certain actions, and you can trade in those dice for certain rolls. Basically, with a bit of a prayer to the Emperor, you can guarantee some important things happen, and there's some decent flexibility with different army builds you could go for. The Adepta Sororitas will generally be pretty infantry heavy, but you can certainly go for more ranged and melee builds, and potentially have a reasonable go at a mechanised army too. I'd say perhaps one of the biggest negatives for the new Sisters are the prices. With new and flashy plastic model kits, they will generally cost you really quite a bit, and the models inside don't always cost all that many points in-game, which can mean that if you're building a Sisters force all the way to 2,000 points, it's going to cost you a bit more, say compared with Space Marines or Chaos Marines or something. Their combat patrol box, as we'll get onto, does seem quite good though, and can help with that a bit. So if you have chosen to settle on Sisters as an army to play, let's just talk a bit about planning out a collection. If you are looking to play games with them, you could think about experimenting with some army list ideas and what you might want to build towards. You could pick up the codex before the rest of the army. If you choose not to go down it, then they always resell quite well. Otherwise there's all sorts of resources out there, including Warhapedia, Battlescribe, Tabletop Simulator, and just proxying other models from other collections to try out the Sisters army. There's loads of inspiration out there for collecting Sisters. Simply type them into YouTube and you'll be rewarded by a fair amount of stuff. I've made a fair few Sisters tactics videos myself, including picking orders and tier rankings of the different units, so feel free to give those a search if you'd like to. Otherwise, if you had any questions, there'll be people falling over to help you on various Facebook, Reddit or Discord groups, so if you did have any simple questions that you wanted answered, they're a really good place to start. For the lore, you can read plenty about them on the various Warhammer wiki sites. There's loads of lore and background content on YouTube, and there's a fair few Black Library novels dedicated to the Sisters of Battle as well. Once you've got some sort of rough idea, you could think about getting a small squad to start painting up. I think I'd think about picking up a box of regular Battle Sisters to start with, just get a bit of a feel for the models, and maybe test out a paint scheme or two before you go all in, all over an army. I'd think about making a rough 2000 point list that you very roughly want to build towards, and start with a 500 point chunk of that so you could play some combat patrol and actually get some games in. Generally I think it's worthwhile collecting armies in small chunks, as after you've played a few games with different units, you might wind up having a very different idea of what you want to build towards after that. You can think about which order you might want to play as. There's some interesting backstory behind them, and some of them really favour melee or ranged sisters a bit more. I'll put a link to my which order to choose video down in the video description, though personally I'd be quite tempted to paint them up in my own colour scheme of one sort or another, and give yourself the option to change game to game if you'd like. Finally, you can also think about what sort of army archetype to build towards. Maybe you want to go for a very heavy melee focused sisters list, loads of Repentia and Zephyrim and Sacrosants and things, or maybe go for more ranged with a bunch of multi-melters, or go for a more mechanised approach, maybe a bunch of gun tanks and things like penitent engines. For first things to buy, I'd strongly consider picking up the Adepta Sororitas Codex. At least then you'll hopefully be a bit more informed for what all the units do, and have a bunch of background and inspiration out of the miniature galleries. And then if I personally were jumping into sisters, I would really strongly be considering the Combat Patrol Adepta Sororitas box. As compared with buying the kits separately, it really gives you a pretty awesome discount. The Combat Patrol boxes are £85, $140 or €110, and the Sisters of Battle one is a slightly weird one. Aside from the Rhino, they are all monopose miniatures, so you don't get all the options for each unit, but I'd say that the sculpts are really quite nice, and I quite like the sheer variety of units that you get in the box. Sure, a few of them might be a bit small or locked to individual gear, but I don't think there's any other Combat Patrol box that gives you 7 different units to play with, and potentially 8 if you wanted to split the Sisters of Battle into 2 5-woman squads. Battle Sisters and Rhinos will basically always be useful. Cannonesses are near mandatory for leading the force. Penitent Engines and Seraphim are both fairly solid. Probably the only slightly weird includes are the quite small little units of the Arcoflagellants and Repentia, though to be honest, to overcome that, if it were me, I'd get 2 of these boxes. That'll actually give you a reasonable size unit of the Arcoflagellants and the Repentia, and then I'd look at converting the Repentia Superior out of the second box into a different character of some sort. If you pick up some spare bits from another kit or two, I'm sure she could make a reasonable stand-in Palatine, or one of the other minor support characters. Being monopose, I know the box isn't for everyone, but for me personally, with around about a 50% saving on buying the kits individually, I would personally be all over this. Otherwise, if you don't fancy the box, I'd think about getting a Canoness, some standard Battle Sisters, and maybe a Rhino or 2. All of those are likely to see a fair bit of play, maybe with a few hard-hitting damage dealers such as Retributors or Repentia, and of course any miniatures that particularly inspire you and really draw you to play Sisters of Battle. If you just love the stained glass look of the Immolator, or the awesome diorama that is the Triumph of St. Catherine, there's certainly nothing wrong with picking up something that you find fun, even if it might not necessarily be one of the most optimal choices you'll use in every game early on. In any case, after you've built up a small core of units, something that you're likely to use in most games, you can think about expanding to other choices, and I'd mainly be looking at units that can deal a lot of damage to the enemy. The Sisters Elite Infantry are largely all very good. Repentia are as ever an absolutely brutal threat charging out of a Rhino. Particularly in Bloody Rose, they'll just be able to tear down whatever gets in their way. I really like the Celestian Sacrosants, a little bit less hitty but very durable with their 2+ armor and 4+ invul. Retributors can still do some awesome damage with their big melter punches, very nice in Argent Shroud in particular. Seraphim are nice and efficient for objectives and actions and things, and roasting some people with some hand flamers if needed. And Zephyrim are a nice fast moving melee threat that are maybe a bit more anti-infantry focus, but can really punch above their weight with some rerolls or stratagems. The Sisters have an absolutely enormous amount of support characters, a lot of which live in the elite slot, things like the Dogmata, Hospitaller, and many more. Personally, I do feel that Games Workshop does overcharge for these quite small miniatures, and unless you really like the look of them, I would be really quite tempted to convert 1 or 2 out of some standard Sisters of Battle. Sure, you could do with a little bit of creativity with spare parts, maybe a touch of green stuff sculpting, but I think often I'd much rather have just a very cheap version of the same model, and it maybe look a little bit more scruffy, and save really quite a lot in the process. In any case, conversions can be quite good fun. Out of these, something that does war hymns could be a quite decent option, and I quite like the Dogmata as a minor melee threat as well, and also having some useful abilities like giving Obsec. I feel like Penitent Engines and particularly Mortifiers are really quite an easy unit to use. I think they're a solid unit particularly for newer players, kind of hard to go too far wrong with, very solid firepower, very solid melee, fairly fast getting towards the opponent, and if they do happen to just get shot down, Then their 5+ ignores wound roll means that your opponent will generally have to dedicate a fair amount of firepower to them, so I think they're really kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Finally, to lead the army, sisters have some really solid HQ choices. In particular, Morven Vaal and Celestine are really very solid right now. Morven Vaal I think is hard to go too far wrong with in virtually any sisters list, provides some awesome rerolls to boost the damage of your squads, is a great melee combatant in her own right, and also fires off a bunch of crack missiles and heavy bolter shots every turn. It's really hard to go too far wrong. So they'd be some of my top picks in game. I did also make a Sisters of Battle tier list of the different units, and again I'll link that down in the video description if it's helpful. Unit strength isn't the only thing to consider, of course, though I do like my armies to both look good and also function well in game. So that just about wraps us up for an intro to collecting Sisters of Battle. Please let me know any other thoughts and insights you might have down in the comments, particularly any tips from veteran Sisters players will be really appreciated. If you've enjoyed the video or found it useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which is how I can make all this content quite so regularly. You can find the link down to that in the video description below as well. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few rewards, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.